The studio buzzed with anticipation as the cameras rolled, capturing the latest episode of John Oliver's talk show, a platform known for its sharp wit and incisive commentary. Tonight's guest was none other than Elon Musk, the tech titan, whose every move sparked headlines and polarized opinions. The audience, a mix of loyal fans and curious onlookers, leaned forward in their seats, sensing the potential for fireworks. Oliver, with his trademark blend of humor and skepticism, opened the segment with a monologue that danced around Musk's recent ventures, from space exploration to social media upheavals. But beneath the jokes lay a pointed question. Was Musk's influence a force for progress or a reckless gamble with global consequences? The crowd laughed, but the tension was palpable. What would happen when these two minds, one a comedian with a moral compass, the other a visionary with a penchant for controversy, collided on live television? Could Oliver hold his own against a man who thrived on defying expectations? And why did the air feel so charged, as if the smallest spark could ignite a blaze? As Musk took the stage, his casual stride belied the weight of his presence. He settled into the guest chair, his expression a mix of amusement and guardedness. Oliver wasted no time diving into questions about Musk's latest project, a neural interface technology that promised to merge human minds with artificial intelligence. The host's tone was light but probing, asking whether such a leap was ethical, given the risks of data privacy and mental autonomy. Musk responded with his usual confidence, painting a future where humanity transcended its biological limits. But Oliver wasn't satisfied. He pressed harder, citing recent reports of regulatory pushback and public unease. Was Musk rushing into uncharted territory without enough safeguards? The audience sensed the shift, the conversation veering from playful banter to something sharper. Musk's smile tightened, his answers growing curt. Oliver, sensing an opening, pivoted to a hotter topic: Musk's role in shaping public discourse. Through his social media platform, the host questioned whether Musk's hands-off approach to content moderation was fueling division, pointing to recent surges in misinformation that had real-world consequences, from election skepticism to health conspiracies. The exchange grew heated, with Oliver's questions carrying an edge of accusation. He challenged Musk on the platform's algorithm, which critics argued amplified outrage over reason. Musk countered that free speech was messy but necessary, and that curating content risked stifling truth. The audience clapped at points, torn between the two perspectives, but the mood in the studio was shifting. Oliver, usually adept at balancing humor with critique, seemed to lean too heavily into the latter, his tone bordering on confrontational. Musk, for his part, began to bristle, his responses laced with a defensive edge. The host doubled down, asking whether Musk's wealth and influence insulated him from the consequences of his decisions. Was he truly accountable to anyone, or did he operate in a bubble of his own making? The question hung in the air, and for a moment the studio fell silent. Musk's eyes narrowed, and the audience held its breath, sensing that the conversation was teetering on the edge of something explosive. What had started as an intellectual sparring match was now a personal challenge, and neither man seemed willing to back down. The segment neared its first commercial break, but the tension showed no signs of easing. Oliver, perhaps sensing the need to lighten the mood, tried to pivot to a lighter question about Musk's electric vehicles, but the attempt felt forced, and Musk wasn't biting. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low but firm, and accused Oliver of cherry-picking facts to fit a narrative. The audience gasped, caught off guard by the directness of the jab. Oliver's face flushed, but he recovered quickly, firing back with a quip about Musk's sensitivity to criticism. The crowd laughed, but it was a nervous sound, masking the unease that rippled through the room. As the show cut to commercial, the cameras panned across the set, capturing the strained expressions of both men. The stage was set for a confrontation that would push boundaries, test egos, and leave the audience questioning where the line between debate and debacle truly lay. The real drama, it seemed, was just beginning.
Hi there, if you are Team Oliver or Musk, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the video.
The commercial break did little to cool the simmering tension on the set. As the cameras blinked back to life, the audience's murmurs hushed, their eyes darting between John Oliver and Elon Musk. The host, still stinging from Musk's accusation of narrative pushing, adjusted his tie and forced a smile, but his posture betrayed a man bracing for battle. Musk, meanwhile, sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest. The stage lights seemed harsher now, casting long shadows that mirrored the growing divide between the two men. Oliver opened, the next segment with a calculated shift, steering the conversation toward Musk's labor practices, a topic that had dogged the billionaire in recent headlines. Reports of grueling work hours and safety concerns at his factories had sparked public outcry, and Oliver, ever the advocate for the underdog, saw an opportunity to hold Musk's feet to the fire. The host's questions were surgical, dissecting the balance between innovation and worker welfare. He cited whistleblower accounts of burnout and injuries, asking Musk how he justified pushing his employees to the brink for the sake of progress. Musk's response was measured at first, emphasizing the high-stakes nature of his industries and the voluntary commitment of his workforce. But Oliver wasn't buying it. He leaned forward, his voice sharp, and pressed Musk on whether his wealth came at the expense of those who couldn't afford to say no. The audience, caught in the crossfire of principle versus pragmatism, shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement with Oliver's moral stance, while others admired Musk's unapologetic drive. The room felt like a powder keg, each question a spark threatening to ignite it. Oliver, sensing the crowd's divided loyalties, doubled down, accusing Musk of prioritizing profits over people. Musk's composure began to crack, his jaw tightened, and his responses grew clipped, laced with irritation. He argued that his companies were revolutionizing the world, creating jobs and opportunities that outweighed the sacrifices. But Oliver, relentless, countered with a pointed jab about Musk's public persona, suggesting that his self-styled image as a savior masked a colder reality. The audience gasped, the line crossing into personal territory. Musk's eyes flashed with something dangerous, and for a moment it seemed he might walk off. Instead, he leaned into the microphone and delivered a stinging retort, calling Oliver a sanctimonious hack who profited off outrage while contributing nothing tangible to the world. The words landed like a slap, and the studio fell silent, the weight of the insult hanging heavy. Oliver's face reddened, his usual quick wit faltering as he grappled with the public humiliation. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some cheering Musk's boldness, others murmuring in disapproval. Oliver, visibly rattled, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, asking about Musk's environmental efforts. But the damage was done. The dynamic had shifted, and Musk, emboldened by his verbal victory, pressed his advantage. He challenged Oliver's credentials, questioning how a comedian could lecture an engineer on running a business. The audience, now fully invested in the escalating drama, leaned forward, their phones discreetly recording the chaos. Oliver, struggling to regain control, attempted a joke to diffuse the tension, but it fell flat, drowned out by the intensity of the moment. Musk's smirk was unmistakable, a silent declaration of dominance that left Oliver scrambling to salvage his authority. As the segment drew to a close, the producers signaled for another break, but the atmosphere was electric, the confrontation far from resolved. Oliver's usual charm had been overshadowed by Musk's ruthless counterattack, and the host's vulnerability was laid bare. The audience, emotionally hooked, buzzed with anticipation, wondering how Oliver would recover from the verbal thrashing. Musk, for his part, seemed invigorated, his earlier defensiveness replaced by a predatory confidence. The stage was no longer a platform for dialogue, but a battlefield, and the next round promised to be even more brutal. The cameras cut away, leaving the audience hungry for what came next, their loyalties torn between the embattled host and the defiant guest. The studio lights flared back on, but the air felt heavier, charged with the unresolved friction between John Oliver and Elon Musk. The audience, still reeling from Musk's biting insult, watched with bated breath as Oliver straightened in his chair, his expression a mix of determination and barely concealed anger. The host knew he was on shaky ground, his authority undermined by Musk's ruthless jab. Yet, surrender wasn't in Oliver's nature. He dove into the next segment with a renewed intensity, pivoting to Musk's influence on global energy markets, a topic that had dominated recent debates. The world was grappling with energy shortages, and Musk's push for renewable solutions had positioned him as both a savior and a disruptor. Oliver, sensing an opportunity to reclaim the narrative, framed his questions around the human cost of Musk's ambitions, particularly in regions dependent on traditional energy. Oliver's tone was deliberate, each word chosen to provoke. He referenced communities displaced by lithium mining for Musk's batteries, asking whether the billionaire's green revolution was built on exploitation. The audience leaned in, drawn to the moral weight of the question. Musk, however, was ready. He countered with data, arguing that his innovations were reducing global emissions and that short-term sacrifices were inevitable for long-term survival. But Oliver wasn't interested in statistics. He pressed harder, accusing Musk of glossing over the human toll to protect his brand. The exchange grew sharper, the two men talking over each other, their voices rising in a cacophony of conviction. The audience, now fully immersed, clapped and gasped, their emotions tugged by the clash of ideals. Oliver's passion was palpable, but so was Musk's defiance, each man refusing to yield an inch. The tension reached a boiling point when Oliver brought up Musk's public statements dismissing government regulations. The host suggested that Musk's disdain for oversight bordered on arrogance, implying that he saw himself above the law. The accusation was a gamble, and it backfired. Musk's face hardened, and he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. He accused Oliver of pandering to a system that stifled progress, calling him a mouthpiece for bureaucrats who clung to power by fear-mongering. The insult was laced with venom, and it stung. Oliver's eyes widened, his composure slipping as the audience erupted in a mix of cheers and boos. The host tried to interject, but Musk wasn't done. He doubled down, mocking Oliver's reliance on scripted outrage to stay relevant, a jab that painted the comedian as a performer rather than a thinker. The crowd's reaction was visceral, some laughing at the audacity, others cringing at the brutality. Oliver, visibly shaken, struggled to regain his footing. His next question, meant to shift focus to Musk's space ventures, came out stilted, lacking the usual bite. Musk seized the moment, steering the conversation to his vision for humanity's future, his words carrying a conviction that captivated the room. The audience, despite the earlier chaos, found themselves nodding, drawn to the grandeur of his ideas. Oliver, sensing the shift in momentum, grew desperate. He interrupted Musk mid-sentence, a move that felt petty and drew murmurs of disapproval. The host's frustration was clear, his earlier confidence eroded by Musk's relentless verbal onslaught. The segment ended abruptly, the producers cutting to commercial earlier than planned, as if to spare Oliver further embarrassment. The break left the studio buzzing, the audience dissecting every moment of the clash. Oliver's team huddled backstage, their whispers urgent, while Musk sat calmly scrolling his phone, exuding an air of untouchability. The host's vulnerability was now a liability, his moral high ground crumbling under Musk's calculated attacks. Yet something in Oliver's eyes suggested he wasn't ready to concede. The audience, emotionally invested, could feel the stakes rising. This wasn't just a talk show spat anymore. It was a test of wills, a public reckoning that exposed the fault lines of power, principle, and pride. The next segment loomed, promising a confrontation that would either redeem the host or cement his defeat. The studio pulsed with raw energy as the show resumed, the audience's anticipation bordering on unease. John Oliver, his face taut with resolve, gripped the edges of his desk, determined to claw back control after Musk's relentless verbal assaults. The guest, Elon Musk, sat with a faint smirk, his earlier venom replaced by a quiet confidence that unnerved the host even more. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion as Oliver launched into the next segment. This time targeting Musk's role in shaping public policy. Recent controversies had swirled around Musk's lobbying efforts, with critics accusing him of wielding his wealth to bend governments to his will. Oliver, sensing a chance to expose hubris, framed his questions as a defense of democracy, asking whether Musk's influence undermined the voice of the average citizen. The host's delivery was fiery, his words dripping with indignation. He cited examples of Musk's companies securing favorable regulations, suggesting that the billionaire's vision for the future came at the expense of fairness. The audience, swayed by Oliver's populist angle, clapped enthusiastically, but Musk remained unfazed. His responses were sharp, framing his advocacy as a necessary push against outdated systems that stifled innovation. He argued that governments, not corporations, were the true gatekeepers of progress, a point that resonated with some in the crowd. Oliver, however, saw an opening and pounced, accusing Musk of buying influence to serve his own interests. The charge was bold, and the studio crackled with tension as the two men locked eyes, neither willing to blink. The audience held its breath, sensing the confrontation teetering on the edge of chaos. Musk's patience, already thin, finally snapped. He leaned forward, his voice low but laced with contempt, and unleashed a scathing retort. He called Oliver a hypocrite who preached equality while cozying up to corporate sponsors, a jab that cut deep into the host's carefully curated image. The insult was personal, ruthless, and delivered with surgical precision, leaving Oliver momentarily speechless. The audience gasped, some cheering Musk's audacity, others recoiling at the cruelty. Oliver's face flushed, his hands trembling as he tried to respond, but Musk pressed his advantage, questioning the host's integrity in a way that felt like a public undressing. The studio felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of humiliation. Oliver's team, watching from the wings, exchanged worried glances, aware that their star was unraveling under the pressure. Desperate to regain ground, Oliver shifted tactics, attempting to humanize the conversation by asking Musk about the personal toll of his relentless ambition. The question was meant to soften the mood, but it backfired. Musk, sensing weakness, dismissed it with a curt remark, implying that Oliver couldn't possibly understand the sacrifices required to change the world. The audience, torn between admiration for Musk's conviction and sympathy for Oliver's struggle, grew restless, their murmurs filling the silence. Oliver, now visibly rattled, tried to pivot to humor, but his jokes landed like lead, each one met with tepid laughter. Musk's dominance was undeniable, his presence commanding the room while Oliver floundered, his usual charisma buried under the weight of repeated blows. As the segment wound down, the producers signaled for a break, but the damage was done. Oliver's attempt to challenge Musk had only deepened his own vulnerability, leaving him exposed as a man outmatched. The audience, emotionally tethered to the drama, buzzed with speculation, wondering if Oliver could salvage his dignity. Musk, meanwhile, exuded an air of triumph, his earlier irritation replaced by a cool assurance that he'd won this round. The cameras cut away, but the story was far from over. Oliver's resolve, though battered, flickered in his eyes, hinting at a final stand. The audience, hooked on the escalating stakes, leaned forward, eager to see if the host could turn the tide, or if Musk's victory would be absolute. The studio lights snapped back on, casting a stark glow over a set that now felt like a gladiatorial arena. John Oliver, his pride battered by Elon Musk's unrelenting verbal onslaught, sat with a steely glint in his eyes, a man pushed to the brink but not yet broken. The audience, their emotions raw from the escalating war of words, watched with a mix of dread and fascination, sensing that the next segment could tip the scales. Musk, his posture relaxed but his gaze piercing, seemed to revel in the chaos he'd sown, his earlier contempt now tempered by a quiet certainty of his dominance. Oliver, aware that his credibility hung by a thread, chose a new angle for the segment, one that played to his strengths, the power of storytelling. He began with a personal anecdote, recounting a conversation with a factory worker who'd been impacted by the tech industry's relentless pace, a subtle nod to Musk's empire. The host's voice was steady, weaving the workers' struggles into a broader critique of unchecked ambition. He framed Musk's innovations as a double-edged sword, capable of uplifting humanity, but also crushing those caught in its machinery. The audience, drawn in by the emotional weight of the story, leaned forward, their earlier division giving way to a shared empathy. Oliver's questions were no longer accusations but pleas for accountability, asking Musk how he reconciled his vision with the human cost. For the first time, Musk seemed momentarily off balance, his usual data-driven defenses less effective against the raw humanity of the narrative. He responded with a vague nod to progress, but his words lacked their earlier fire, and the crowd sensed a crack in his armor. Oliver, seizing the moment, pressed further, asking whether Musk ever doubted his choices or felt the weight of the lives he influenced. The shift in dynamic was palpable, and Musk's irritation flared. He snapped back, accusing Oliver of manipulating emotions to score cheap points, a remark that carried a cruel edge, dismissing the host's sincerity as theatrical. The audience gasped, the insult reigniting the tension that had briefly softened. Oliver's face tightened, but this time he didn't falter. Instead, he leaned into the attack, turning Musk's words against him. He argued that empathy wasn't a weakness but a necessity, and that leaders like Musk had a responsibility to listen, not deflect. The crowd erupted in applause, their support bolstering Oliver's resolve. Musk, caught off guard by the host's recovery, tried to pivot to his achievements, but Oliver cut him off, his voice rising with a passion that filled the room. The host was no longer just defending himself, he was fighting for something bigger, a principle that resonated with the audience's growing unease about unchecked power. The confrontation reached a fever pitch as Oliver posed a final searing question. Did Musk believe his wealth and influence gave him the right to dictate humanity's future? The studio fell silent, the weight of the challenge hanging heavy. Musk's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed he might unleash another cutting retort. Instead, he hesitated, his silence speaking louder than any insult. The audience, emotionally tethered to the moment, clapped wildly, sensing that Oliver had finally landed a blow. Musk, visibly rattled, tried to recover with a dismissive quip, but it fell flat, drowned out by the crowd's fervor. Oliver, his confidence restored, sat back, his expression one of quiet triumph. The segment ended on a high note, the producers letting the applause linger before cutting to commercial, a rare concession to the moment's intensity. The break left the studio electric, the audience buzzing with excitement over Oliver's comeback. Musk, for the first time, looked unsettled, his earlier swagger diminished by the host's emotional gambit. Oliver's team, sensing a turning point, rallied around him, their whispers filled with cautious optimism. The stage was set for a final reckoning, one that would test both men's limits. The audience, fully invested, could feel the narrative shifting, their loyalties swinging toward the host who'd found his footing. The next segment promised not just a clash but a resolution, one that would leave no question unanswered. The studio crackled with anticipation as the show roared back to life, the audience's energy a living pulse that fueled the escalating drama. John Oliver, buoyed by his emotional triumph in the previous segment, sat with a newfound authority, his earlier vulnerability replaced by a quiet fire. Elon Musk, his composure fraying, gripped the armrests of his chair, his eyes darting as if searching for a way to reclaim the narrative. The crowd, now firmly in Oliver's corner, leaned forward, their cheers from the last segment still echoing in their minds. The host, sensing the tide had turned, opened the next segment with a bold move, diving into the heart of Musk's public persona, his self-proclaimed mission to save humanity. Oliver framed it not as a critique, but as a challenge, asking whether Musk's vision was truly universal or merely a reflection of his own ego. The question was a masterstroke, cutting through Musk's defenses with surgical precision. Oliver's tone was calm but unrelenting, weaving together examples of Musk's grandiose promises, from colonizing Mars to rewiring human brains, and juxtaposing them with the chaos his decisions often left behind. The audience, emotionally tethered to the host's narrative, nodded in agreement, their earlier admiration for Musk tempered by Oliver's piercing logic. Musk, visibly unsettled, tried to counter with his usual rhetoric about humanity's survival, but his words sounded rehearsed, lacking the conviction that had once captivated the room. Oliver pounced, pressing Musk on whether his solutions prioritize the elite over the masses, a question that struck at the core of the billionaire's legacy. The studio buzzed with tension, the audience hanging on every word as the confrontation edged toward its climax. Musk's frustration boiled over, and he lashed out with a venomous retort, accusing Oliver of being a jealous cynic who tore down builders to mask his own irrelevance. The insult was vicious, designed to wound, and it landed with a thud. But this time Oliver was ready. He absorbed the blow without flinching, his response swift and devastating. He argued that true leadership required humility, not hubris, and that Musk's refusal to acknowledge his flaws endangered the very future he claimed to protect. The audience erupted, their applause shaking the studio as Oliver's words resonated with a clarity that cut through the noise. Musk, caught off guard by the host's resilience, faltered, his next attempt at a comeback stumbling into silence. The crowd's reaction was deafening, their support for Oliver a tidal wave that left Musk stranded. Sensing the moment was his, Oliver pushed further, challenging Musk to admit a single mistake, any crack in his infallible facade. The question was a trap, and Musk knew it. His hesitation spoke volumes, each second of silence amplifying Oliver's dominance. The audience, now fully invested in the host's redemption, cheered wildly, their emotions cresting as they witnessed Musk's unraveling. Oliver, his confidence at its peak, delivered a final, heartfelt plea urging Musk to consider the human cost of his ambition, not as a critique, but as a call to be better. The sincerity of the moment disarmed the room, even quieting Musk, who sat back, his expression a mix of defiance and doubt. The segment ended with the audience on its feet, their ovation a testament to Oliver's hard-won victory. The producers, recognizing the intensity of the moment, let the cameras linger before cutting to commercial, capturing the stark contrast between Oliver's quiet triumph and Musk's visible discomfort. The studio was alight with emotion, the audience buzzing with a sense of catharsis. Oliver's team, watching from the sidelines, exchanged nods of pride, knowing their host had turned the tables. Musk, for the first time, seemed mortal, his earlier arrogance buried under the weight of Oliver's relentless clarity. The stage was set for a final act, one that would cement the host's comeback and bring the confrontation to a decisive close. The audience, their hearts racing, waited eagerly for the resolution they could feel coming. The studio hummed with a victorious energy as the final segment began, the audience's fervor a palpable force that lifted John Oliver to new heights. The host, his earlier wounds transformed into battle scars, sat with a quiet confidence, his eyes locked on Elon Musk. The guest, once an untouchable titan, now appeared diminished, his earlier bravado eroded by Oliver's relentless onslaught. The crowd, their emotions tethered to the host's journey from humiliation to triumph, sat on the edge of their seats, sensing the confrontation was hurtling toward a definitive end. Oliver, fully in command, opened the segment with a bold declaration, framing the entire evening as a reckoning not just for Musk, but for the unchecked power of those who shape the world. The statement was less a question than a challenge, daring Musk to justify his influence in the face of mounting scrutiny. Oliver's approach was masterful, blending wit with a moral clarity that resonated deeply. He revisited the night's themes, from labor practices to public discourse, but now wove them into a singular narrative, the responsibility of power. He asked Musk point-blank whether he saw himself as a steward of humanity's future or merely its architect, a distinction that carried profound weight. The audience, captivated by the host's eloquence, leaned forward, their silence a testament to the moment's gravity. Musk, cornered by the question's simplicity, struggled to respond, his usual rhetoric falling flat against Oliver's unyielding focus. The billionaire's attempt to deflect with a jab about Oliver's idealism was met with boos, the crowd's loyalty now firmly with the host. Musk's face tightened, his frustration palpable as he realized the room had turned against him. The tension peaked when Oliver, sensing the endgame, delivered a searing monologue. He spoke not to Musk, but to the audience, arguing that progress without accountability was a hollow promise, and that true vision required courage to face one's flaws. The words were a direct rebuke of Musk's hubris, and they struck like lightning. The audience erupted, their applause a roaring validation of Oliver's stand. Musk, visibly shaken, tried one final retort, accusing Oliver of grandstanding for ratings, but the insult was feeble, drowned out by the crowd's fervor. Oliver, unfazed, turned the accusation into a rallying cry, declaring that speaking truth to power was worth any cost. The studio shook with cheers, the emotional crescendo lifting everyone in the room. Musk, his defenses shattered, sat back, his silence a concession of defeat. In a final dramatic flourish, Oliver made a decision that stunned the room. He calmly asked Musk to leave the set, framing it not as an act of anger but as a stand for principle. The audience gasped, then roared in approval, their emotions cresting as they witnessed the host's ultimate triumph. Musk, his expression, a mix of disbelief and resignation, stood and walked off, the cameras capturing every step of his exit. The crowd's ovation grew deafening, a celebration of Oliver's redemption and the power of conviction. The host, alone on stage, took a moment to absorb the moment, his face a blend of exhaustion and pride. He closed the show with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the audience, thanking them for standing with him in a battle that felt bigger than one night. As the credits rolled, the studio remained electric, the audience on their feet, their cheers echoing long after the cameras stopped. Oliver's team rushed to his side, their embraces a testament to the night's hard-won victory. The story was complete, a journey from humiliation to triumph that left no loose ends. The audience, emotionally fulfilled, filed out buzzing with all their faith in the power of principle restored. Oliver, stepping off the set, carried the weight of a man who'd faced a giant and emerged not just victorious, but transformed. The night was his, a testament to the strength of standing, firm no matter the odds.